Thank you very much, Roger O'Neill. And I know that they were listening very carefully when Secretary of State Cheney and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell and others, all the way up to the President of the United States, said, yes, it is going well in the early stages, but let us not get ahead of ourselves. And there is enormous relief when the first combat mission is completed, but unfortunately, there will be a second and a third and a fourth, and we do not know yet how many altogether. With me now is Joseph Bermudez. He's a defense analyst. He specializes in ballistic missiles. There's been a lot of discussion tonight about that Scud missile that the Iraqis have, that they launched. 5 or 6 of them landed in Tel Aviv, 1 in Haifa maybe, and 1 headed for Saudi Arabia, but the Patriot was able to knock it out of the sky. First combat testing. Does that surprise you?
No, actually, I expected the Patriot to do very well. We've been developing it for several years now, a product improvement to it to be used in the anti-tactical ballistic mode. And the Scud is a very basic ballistic missile. Its trajectory is well known. So I was fairly confident that the Patriot, if called upon, could do it.
Why wouldn't the Israelis know they were on the way?
That would probably be, they probably did know a couple of minutes after they took off. And that's probably why the air raid sirens sounded, and from what I can tell right now, that's when the missiles hit. It's one thing I would like to point out, there is a misconception. These are not Scud-B missiles, which everybody refers to them. They're the Iraqi variant, which has a greater range.
Is that what they look like right there?
Yes, basically. It looks a little longer. The Iraqis enlarged the fuel tanks, decreased the warhead, and gave it an increased range of 600 kilometers. A Scud-B, a standard Scud-B, could not reach Israel from Iraq. So these are actually al-Husseins.
And these mobile launchers from which they launch them, once they do launch them, how swiftly can they move those launchers out of the way so that you can't go in and knock them out?
It could probably displace in 15 to 30 minutes. Then they would probably move it at least 45 minutes to an hour away from its previous firing position. And it would take 45 minutes to 90 minutes to reload, refuel, and put in the targeting data.
So they're pretty hard to find and to knock down.
Yes. And the key thing here is we want to get the launchers and not necessarily the missiles, because missiles without a launcher are useless.
Yeah. So the chances of doing that during daylight hours, now that we know where the original site was?
The daylight hours are better, but Hussein's not a dumb man. He'll try to hide them. He obviously was successful in hiding them during the first strikes.
It seems like a very feeble counterattack to all of us on the part of Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
Are you surprised by this?
No, I kind of expected him to attempt it. Of a military value, it was nil. Yeah. You know, 1 aircraft coming in and dropping bombs would be more effective militarily. But it's a political operation, and that's why it was done.
But even as a political operation, it shows that he doesn't have a whole lot of firepower that he can send up.
Yes. It's just the way things happen in the Middle East.
That's always the explanation, Mr. Bermudez.
That's exactly true.
Where did he get the Scud missiles?
Originally, he got the Scud missiles from the Soviet Union. And later on, he developed the capability to produce components and then entire systems within his country. He imported components, obviously, but for the most part, they're completely manufactured within Iraq.
As you watch the arms transfers around the world, are you always astonished at the level at which they are still going on?
Yes, but there's also another factor here. Most of the components used to build a missile of the Scud type are actually dual-use items. You know, you can use one steel for many things. So it's kind of hard to restrict this kind of technology throughout the Third World.
How did you develop your fascination for missiles?
I developed it because a friend of mine, Seth Karras, who was on previously, and I had decided that ballistic missiles in the Third World were an important topic for the nation, and began our research many years ago.
All right, thank you very much for being with us tonight. This has been very helpful, very clear.
Thank you very much.
We have a much better understanding now of what has been going on there. We've been talking about it here as well all night long, but not nearly as coherently as you just did. Joyce Starr and Dr. Robert Lieber, Richard Lieber, are with us now, still in our Washington studios. Joyce, the camera's on you right now, so we're going to begin with you, if we can. Talk about the relationship between the Israeli government and the Bush administration before all of this began. it was chilly at best, right?
Tom, it was quite cool, and that was very difficult for the Israelis to understand. Why was it so cool? Because, of course, during the Reagan administration, they'd had a very warm relationship with Washington. But I think that there is a very vast cultural gap between the way that our present decision makers do business and the Israeli leadership.
And Mr. Lieber, let me ask you as well. John Cochran was saying just a few moments ago, it really doesn't make any difference if they have a good personal relationship. Think that's true?
I think it's true to some extent. The personal relationship mattered a great deal during the Reagan administration. That same chemistry is not there. Nonetheless, in the present circumstances, the U.S. and Israel have a lot of common interests and a lot of strategic reasons that draw them together, partly not to get at cross purposes. For example, if Israel does retaliate, you want to make sure that Israeli aircraft and other aircraft in the coalition don't get in each other's way. The other thing is that Israel is not a one-bullet regime. Come what may, the Israelis are reliable members of the coalition in a sense. On the other hand, relations between Bush on the one hand and Shamir on the other have not been great, and Shamir is not the easiest person to get along with. But the fundamental basis of the relationship remains very deep-seated.
Professor, I do apologize for switching back and forth in your name tonight. I've been given several variations of it. We do know that it begins with an R.
Right, fair enough. My father will appreciate the correction.
All right, Robert Lieber, thank you very much. Joyce Starr, thank you very much as well. Here in the studio with me now is someone who has been with us today. Mr. Hormats is with Goldman Sachs. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. Bob, as you look at what's going on in the financial markets in Tokyo and in this country, what can we expect if the president is able to wrap this up from a military point of view fairly quickly?
Well, today the market started out very euphoric, and they ended up quite confused, particularly the Tokyo market, because it saw a war that the United States had been dominating, perhaps turning into an Arab-Israeli war, depending on what happens and whether the Israelis respond. If it doesn't become a wider war involving Israel, then I think the market will be quite optimistic and figure this thing can be brought to a successful conclusion relatively rapidly. If it becomes a wider war, we'll have great volatility in the markets, and they'll be confused for at least a number of days.
We simply cannot say at this hour which way it may go, because we don't know what the response is going to be. It's that wild case of dominoes that goes on in the Middle East. The price of oil dropped precipitously today.
Yes.
If things stay relatively stable in the military campaign and oil is down there around $18, $19, $20 a barrel, impact on the American economy?
That's a very beneficial impact on the American economy. We have a lot of economic problems. One of them was oil prices. That skimmed off a lot of purchasing power that could have been used for other things. If oil prices go down, it means you have more money in your pocket to buy other goods, helps other industries. It also means lower inflation, and that's very good, pushes interest rates down. It means it's easier to finance your car or your house.
Defense industries were on the skids because of the build down in Europe and in other places. As a result of this military operation over there, there's going to be a lot of replacement needed. A lot of stock is going to have to go back. Do they make a little U-turn, do you think?
The defense industries will do a little bit better. Their stocks, when the war began, went up. They'll probably continue to go up if it looks like it's going to be a relatively long war. If it looks like it's going to be a short war, the stocks of those companies go down, and the companies don't get much long-term benefit out of a short war.
All right, let's say you're a political animal as well as an economic animal. If President Bush does emerge from all of this with a big victory, political and military, his stock will be sky high, obviously. He'll have a lot of political capital. How should he use that political capital?
This is a very important thing for the president. He comes in, if he wins the war successfully on the crest of a wave, he ought to do a number of things, particularly to deal with the domestic economy. We need to reform the banking system to improve it and make it more competitive. We need to deal with education, very important economically. We probably need to deal with energy, and certainly need to deal with energy in a much more intensive way, maybe an energy import tax or something to help us to realize we cannot put our economy in harm's way every few years with events in the Middle East.
Would you guess that he'll have a more attentive Congress?
The Congress will be riding on his every word. He'll come across strong. Congress loves a winner, and our allies love a winner. And if he uses the strength he develops as a result of the success, he can do a number of things domestically to restructure our economy and also to build a new world order of the type he wants, making a more organized alliance to deal with economic issues and political issues.
At the same time, just as in war, in politics as well, there's a Murphy's Law. If it can go wrong, it will, won't it?
That's the problem. We've seen, everyone was so happy about events this morning, and now we've seen a number of complications. And again, as we were saying, it's the Middle East, and anything can happen, and markets can turn on a dime. If the Middle East goes badly, they'll turn very sour and very negative.
All right, thank you very much. Bob Hormats, who is with Goldman Sachs, a former member of the State Department. Terrific title, Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. We have a report now from one of our pool reporters. Gaining air superiority, of course, in this opening offensive was absolutely vital. It's probably the key to ensuring the success on the ground with a maximum of speed and a minimum of losses. A variety of combat aircraft have targeted missile installations, weapons facilities, combat headquarters, and so on. And as NBC's Gary Matsumoto reports tonight, time essentially was everything.
The Air Force may do its fighting in the air, but the battle begins on the ground. The enemy here, time. There's not enough of it. In the air, the plane is a hunter. On the ground, it's a target. To get the plane back where it can do some damage, the Air Force has perfected what it calls the integrated combat turn, the equivalent of a Formula One pit stop. It's dangerous work. On this F-15 interceptor, there are 8 missiles to be mounted, bandoliers of 20mm ammo fed into the cannons, and over 20,000 pounds of fuel to be pumped in or strapped on in fuel tanks. All this at double time.
We can probably reload an airplane, fuel him, and get him back in the air quicker than you can change the oil in your car.
The clock was ticking on this operation. It took 20 minutes. Normal peacetime servicing would take hours. This 20-minute turnaround can be done up to 8 times a day.
And when we go through surge operations, we can turn an airplane 5, 6, 7, 8 times consecutively. That's absolutely no problem at all.
It's a problem for the Iraqis. The speed of these crews increases the amount of time planes like the F-15 are in combat.
It's a very formidable weapons platform. Whatever it goes up against, we've got a guarantee that if it flies, it dies.
That is Gary Matsumoto, who is one of the pool reporters that has been assigned by the Defense Department under a fairly strict set of rules to go out and to be assigned to different locations. And then that is shared by all of the networks. This war is much different than the war in Vietnam, in which correspondents had a fairly wide latitude, picking their assignments, going off on their own, and reporting what they saw, even if they wandered away from their units. In Saudi Arabia, we were all assigned minders. You had public information officers with you at all times, and a set of guidelines in which you were not to quote the enlisted men by name, for example. You could only quote officers because they were worried about reprisals against some of the families. It was very difficult to wander away from one of your minders and get some spontaneous reaction from the young men or the young women who were working out there. This is tightly controlled in part because the military feels strongly that they began to lose the war at home when they allowed reporters to report just exactly what was going on in Vietnam. So there's been a kind of tug of war. By and large, it's been pretty spirited, but at the same time good-natured, although I dare say that today we have been getting very meager information at all from the Pentagon in terms of what has been going on over their targets that have been hit. The last official briefing now was at 9:30 this morning. That's about 15 hours ago. And there's been very little information that has been available to the American public in terms of what is going on in their names and involving their loved ones, of course. We'll be back with continuing coverage here of Operation Desert Storm. America goes to war right after this. We have always talked about the Middle East as a complex and volatile place, but I dare say no one could have imagined the scenario that we are now so deeply involved in. In Washington tonight are 2 experts on that part of the world, Joyce Starr and Professor Robert Lieber. Let's begin with you, Joyce. Did you ever think it would come to this with all the various interlocking parts?
No, I certainly did not, and neither did, I think, anyone in the White House or the State Department. We must remember that we're in this situation because we so vastly miscalculated the Arab mind, in particular Saddam Hussein's mind, in terms of his intentions to move into Kuwait and take all of Kuwait.
And what about you, Robert Lieber?
Well, I think the roots of this problem go back to the late 80s. The Reagan administration was not wrong to tilt to Iraq at a time when it looked as though Iran might win the Iran-Iraq war. The problem is that our real interest was in maintaining a balance of power in the region, so neither of the really big threatening countries, Iran, Iraq, or for that matter Syria, would become so dominant they could threaten all their neighbors. The real root of the problem is that when the tide of battle finally shifted against Iran, the late Reagan and the early Bush administration failed to appreciate that, and they continue to embrace Iraq instead of backing off it somewhat. And I think that lies at the heart of the failure not to take a tougher attitude toward Iraq in the last couple of years as the Iraqis increased their missile preparation, the threats to their neighbors, and the like. Some added deterrence there might have helped, although I think it's also true that the Bush administration has done a remarkably skillful job since the crisis broke on August 2nd.
In fact, we did not even come down hard on Saddam Hussein after he used chemical attacks on the Kurdish tribesmen.
That's precisely an example.
Right. Are you surprised that there hasn't been more of an uprising in the occupied territories of Israel? The Intifada is still alive, obviously, and yet with this massive military campaign underway, there has been almost no activity there in the last 24 hours.
Well, there's a sense of disarray there, I think. The Intifada began as a kind of spontaneous street-level outburst in frustration at the ongoing festering problem at a time when the Arab governments in the region had turned their back on it, and there was a lot, really, I think, of contempt for Arafat and his inability to do much as a leader, neither to make war nor to make peace. But in the present circumstances, the Palestinians in the occupied territories are in disarray. At first, they embraced Saddam because he was anti-Israel, although the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a monstrous irrelevance for Saddam. But on the other hand, Palestinians have been hurt badly by Saddam's actions. The financial cost to the PLO of Saddam's actions has been catastrophic, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lived in Kuwait and to some degree have been victimized by Saddam's rape of that country. So I think the Palestinians in the occupied territories are left in a position of frustration, but I'm not surprised there has not been a more violent uprising or a series of demonstrations since the outbreak of the fighting yesterday.
Joyce Starr, let me ask you about the relationship that we now have established with Hafez al-Assad in Syria, a man whose record is no more endearing, really, than Saddam Hussein's, except he hasn't invaded any countries recently. Will that come back to haunt us?
It may come back to haunt us. It certainly is going to be a price that we'll have to pay, perhaps in the peace process. And on the positive side, of course, it means that Saddam Hussein is the enemy of Hafez Assad, and therefore Assad is not likely to be involved in any dubious actions in Lebanon for the short term, and perhaps not in international terrorism for the short term. But I think we have to have really a wait-and-see attitude about Syria. So far, so good, but it's a very short-term renewal of so-called positive dialogue between ourselves and the Syrians. Sure. By the way, I just want to point out to you that one of the reasons, perhaps, that we've not seen more action on the West Bank and Gaza in the last 48 hours is because there is a severe curfew anticipating this kind of outbreak.
Joyce Starr, thank you very much. Robert Lieber as well. Thanks to all of you. My colleague Garrett Utley will be spilling me here momentarily. Back after this.
The crisis turns to war, and America turns to NBC News. Wherever news breaks, whatever it takes.
From NBC News, America at War continues.
evening. Garrick Utley sitting in now. Tom Brokaw has had a shift change. Tom's been here for about 12 hours, and at NBC News we let people get off after about 12 hours in these very unusual times. We're going to be here with you throughout the evening to the early morning hours. Mary Alice Williams will be joining me in just a few minutes. As you know, we are continuing to follow the events in the war in the Persian Gulf area. The major stories today of the missile attacks against Israel, light casualties, light damage. So far, no announcement from the Israeli government as to whether there will be retaliation against Iraq. Big question for tomorrow, and it already is tomorrow in the Persian Gulf area, is whether Saddam Hussein's forces will be able to unleash more missile attacks, either against Israel or against Saudi Arabia. The one attempt today was foiled when the missile was shot down. Arthur Kent in Saudi Arabia, what's happening there?
Is absolutely deafening when they pass our position. That was a British Tornado ground attack plane, and in just a moment his wingmate will probably be scorching by us. Here he comes, and once again we'll be losing audio momentarily. You can see very clearly the long-range fuel tank under his left wing. That's going to help carry him forward toward his location in Kuwait, his target in Kuwait or Iraq. And we've noticed a pickup, an acceleration of activity here, Garrick, over the last 2 hours. This now makes about 8, we believe, Tornado aircraft, ground attack aircraft scrambled. More than 24 American and Saudi F-15 interceptors going up to ride shotgun over the strikes in Kuwait and Iraq. And Garrick, some news this morning. Some hard news about an incident yesterday, which an unusual incident. We heard a lot about air activity, not much about the situation on the ground. But you'll remember we told you very initial reports of sporadic Iraqi artillery shelling from southern Kuwait over the border into the northern Saudi coastal town of Khafji. We've now found out that two U.S. Marines were, in the words of the Marine Corps, slightly injured during that shelling. The 1st Marine Division headquarters reports this. There were a couple of Marine bunkers and dugouts damaged in the shelling. And we had known, of course, that some of the Iraqi shells had hit an oil facility and set alight an oil storage tank. What we did not have much detail on, Garrick, until now, is the fact that the Marine Corps staged a very rapid and very powerful counterstrike some 5 to 10 kilometers north of the Kuwait-Saudi border into Iraqi-occupied Kuwait, and wiped out an Iraqi command post and severely damaged an Iraqi artillery battery, again with Harrier jump jets of the Marine Corps, with Marine Cobra helicopter gunships, and we are told as well with Air Force A-10 ground attack airplanes.
But again, Arthur, the other point to make there is that these were aerial assaults by the Marines. The Marine ground forces or Army ground forces did not actually cross the border in pursuit of the Iraqi artillery. We're correct in that.
Yes, that's right, Garrick. No ground forces on the move as yet, although we've seen a pattern develop over the last 24 hours of ground forces of the U.S.-led coalition edging closer, moving closer, the jumping in the parlance of the 1st Infantry Division, Big Red 1, from one camp forward to another. So things are progressing on the ground, and this was a very daring strike, a low-level aerial attack in visual range, close visual range of Iraqi targets.
Well, Arthur, let's follow up on this point as far as the American land forces are concerned. They've been there for several months now. There are convoys reported on the move. As you indicated, they are jumping from one position to the next. What does that lead you to believe, the fact that there is now this movement going on of large numbers of troops?
Well, I think it's unreasonable to say that we've seen any signs. We've certainly had no official word that there is a ground offensive planned in the next few days. We have been cautioned that the aerial aspect of this assault on Iraqi military positions in Kuwait and Iraq will go on for some time, perhaps 3 to 10 days. But it certainly indicates, and the reports we're getting back from the Pentagon-supervised pools of journalists with ground forces forward bears out that troops are being prepared, they're being sensitized, they're being psyched up, if you will, for the possibility of an immediate order to advance into Iraqi-held territory and take on the ground, Saddam Hussein's, the remnants, rather, after these aerial bombardments of Saddam Hussein's very formidable land force.
All right, Arthur Kent in Saudi Arabia, thank you. Let's go to the Pentagon now and get Fred Francis's input. Fred, you're listening to Arthur there in Saudi Arabia. Some units appear to be on the move. Do you have any indication from your point of view there in the Pentagon as to what this could mean?
Well, I can confirm what Arthur said. We are moving units. This country is moving units, but not in anticipating going over the line, as it were, and trying to punch a hole into the Iraqi defenses in Kuwait. They're moving units which were 40, 50 miles behind the lines all this time, pretty close to the front, just in case that is called for at the end of this bombing campaign. As Arthur said, the bombing campaign is expected to last 3 to 10 days. I would lead you to believe it would last towards the latter 10 days, and I don't anticipate, based on everything I've learned here in the Pentagon today and yesterday, that the United States will begin a ground war until it has literally pounded every military target it can find, not just in Iraq, but seriously pound those military targets in Kuwait. They began that today, Garrick. They began B-52 bombing of the Republican Guards. That's the elite tank unit of Saddam's army. They began that pounding today. They also began these low-level air attacks with A-10 Warthogs, the tank killers, which are, I guess, 20 years old now, but very effective against tanks. They sent Apache helicopters, the latest version of the Army's tank-killing helicopters, into Kuwait to shoot at Iraqi tanks. So that all began today. Was it interrupted by the missile scare and the missiles into Saudi Arabia and Israel? It certainly was, but more emotionally than militarily. One senior military official told me earlier this evening, he said, "We believe the coalition will hold together," the military coalition. He said, before we began all this, we laid out all these scenarios to the Syrians, to the Egyptians. What if Israel gets hit? How this could happen? And they laid them all out, and all of them said they would stay under all circumstances. And and finally, I would tell you, Garrick, that this same senior military official said, you must remember that while the end is not in doubt of this military action, that there are going to be days like this, that Saddam has a great many weapons at his disposal, not just missiles, but he has terrorism. He can destroy the oil fields in Kuwait. He can do a great many things. And while the end is not in doubt, there will be blips like this over the next several days. Garrick?
Well, Fred, you raised a point which piques my curiosity. As these bombing attacks continue, particularly the B-52 heavy carpet bombing against Iraqi positions in Kuwait, do we know whether Saddam Hussein, back there in Baghdad, probably several layers down in his well-fortified bunker, is able to get information as to what is happening to his forces there, or is he cut off? Because a key decision on the Iraqi part is whether Saddam knows what is happening to his troops in the field.
Well, we think he's cut off from those troops on the front line, because one of the first targets hit yesterday, several hours into the campaign, were the Corps and Division headquarters occupying Kuwait. And those are the generals and the colonels who are in charge of the entire fortifications throughout Kuwait. So those headquarters were hit very severely, and their radios and communications facilities were hit severely. So he may not know what's going on in the front, and he's certainly not going to put any airplanes up to find out, and he may not be able to give any orders to the front. And that's what the United States tried to do initially, continues to do today, and will continue to do over the next several days: isolate those troops on the ground. Iraqi soldiers operate under the Soviet system. They need a great deal of centralized control, And without that centralized control, they hope the system degrades and that the Iraqi army degrades.
Fred Francis, the Pentagon, thank you. You mentioned how they operate under a sort of Soviet tactical planning. Of course, the Soviets had a great influence there in terms of military strategy, also in terms of armaments. And today, the Soviet foreign minister made a speech in Moscow in which he talked about the war, the attacks against Baghdad and Iraq, and mentioned or raised a very sensitive issue for the Soviet government, the fact that the Iraqi air defense, which is basically a Soviet-built air defense, wasn't effective at all. And so the Soviet officials in Moscow went to great lengths to emphasize that the fault, indeed the fault which appeared to occur, was not in the hardware, the technology, but in the hands of the people, that is the Iraqis, who are operating the Soviet anti-air defenses. In other words, in the Moscow's, Kremlin's view, the problem is not in the equipment, it was in the Iraqis trying to handle it. Gary Sick, you've been with us for so many hours these last few days looking at what's happening. We've been talking about Saudi Arabia, about Kuwait and Iraq, but I think we should take a moment and just expand our vision a bit to what's happening in some of the neighboring countries now. We have Turkey to the north, we have Jordan to the west, we have Iran to the east. We don't focus much on Iran. It's a big country and it has keen interest in what happens there. What do you pick up?
Well, it really is quite interesting, and a lot's been going on inside Iran during this period of time. They've been having an internal battle among themselves, a political struggle over who's going to really run that country. But more to the immediate point, 7 days ago, the Iranians began full-scale military maneuvers along the Iraqi border, all the way up and down the whole length of it, including the use of new MiG-29 fighters, which they have received from the Soviet Union. And nobody paid any attention to this at all.
We were distracted.
We were distracted. Nobody was paying any attention to it. One, the fact that they've got these new high-performance aircraft, and two, that they're conducting very significant operations up and down that border.
Now, how do you interpret this, the significance of this?
Well, they say, of course, that this is being done for defensive purposes, that in case the United States decides, somebody decides to do something, they will be prepared to defend their own territory. But it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to figure that a country that fought 8 years with Iraq over that border territory is going to be a little bit concerned about what goes on over there. And I can imagine very easily a situation where things begin to deteriorate, collapse inside Iraq, and they would claim that they needed to establish some kind of security across the border.
We've been talking about this irony here that as we're trying to destroy Saddam Hussein's military muscle, his war machine, we also should be worried about destroying it completely, because then there'd be the vacuum. If it were to happen, how far do you think the Iranians would move in? How big a piece of that Iraqi land would they want to occupy?
Well, I think that's a very hard question to answer. Ideally, if it really were collapsed and nothing was in their way, they would love to take Najaf and Karbala, the two holy sites down south of Baghdad that are the two most holy sites in all of Shia Islam, and which they are very unhappy about the fact that it happens to be in Iraq right now, that they have to go to make their pilgrimage.
And we should emphasize the point that Iran is a Shiite Muslim state.
The southern half of Iraq is Shia, and the Shias amount to about 60% of the population.
And that should be of some concern to us, to have an enlarged Shiite Iranian state that much closer to Iraq.
We were very concerned about this during the Iran-Iraq War, when it looked for a while as if Iran might actually win, and that they were beginning to push across the border. That's when we began providing military equipment to Iraq and really beefing up our activities.
Okay, other neighbors, briefly. Turkey to the north. We don't hear much about Turkey.
No, we haven't.
Important.
Actually, Turkey yesterday, the parliament met and passed a resolution that permitted direct U.S. military operations out of NATO bases against Iraq. They didn't say that, but they're free to do so. In fact, F-111s took off from Turkey today for strikes. They didn't say where they were going, but we think we can imagine where they were going.
That amounts almost to a declaration of war.
And the other thing that they did was say that Turkish troops are now permitted to make cross-border operations, which basically means that the Turks would be permitted to go into northern Iraq, which Turkey has always claimed.
So Saddam Hussein has to be very concerned down there in his bunker.
I should think he should be very concerned.
All right, third front, the west, that is Jordan. Now, when this started, many people thought that of all the victims, King Hussein of Jordan might be at the top of the list, particularly if Israel is drawn into the war.
Right.
Jordan, as Jordan disappears, King Hussein ends up somewhere else, but no longer on his throne. How do you see his vulnerability now that we're in a day or day and a half into this?
It's very hard to read. Nothing apparently has happened in the streets of Amman that would change things. There's been no demonstrations against the king. As far as I know, they're in desperate political and economic circumstances in any case. And I think they are sort of living on a day-to-day basis, depending on what happens in Iraq. If Iraq collapses, they are the buffer between Israel and Iraq, and there's no telling what might happen under those circumstances.
Now, why haven't we seen crowds, demonstrations, masses of Islamic people, Muslims, outraged, taking to the streets, shouting, "Down with America"?
Well, a very smart man the other day told me, who has been involved in the forecasting business, he said the iron law of forecasting is that things always take longer to develop than you expect, and then they go faster and further than you anticipated. And I think what we're seeing with the Islamic reaction is that it hasn't really picked up momentum yet. The leadership isn't there. They haven't got their slogans and the crowds organized.
And we should also remember that tomorrow, Friday, is the holy day there.
That's right.
It is the day off. People don't work. Big call to prayer, midday, that may be when we start to see some demonstrations.
I think as days go on and they absorb the news, then we're going to begin to see some action.
All right, Gary Sick, thank you very much. We'll be talking to you further throughout the evening and the days to come. President Bush, of course, is following everything very closely down at the White House. John Cochran, our chief White House correspondent, is there. John, what can you tell us about what the president might be planning to do tomorrow, day 3?
Well, I can tell you two things that were on his agenda. This may have changed, however, because of the attack on Israel by Saddam Hussein tonight, or now it's now this morning's. Tomorrow, the president, or today, depending on which time zone you're in, anyway, around midday, the president is going to go over to the Pentagon War Room to get a very detailed briefing, his most detailed briefing yet on the war. And of course, he'll be getting an up-to-date briefing also on the attack on the Israelis. We'll know for sure exactly how much success the United States has had in trying to knock out the Iraqi missile sites. That, of course, is the promise that Secretary of State Jim Baker made to Prime Minister Shamir in a telephone conversation tonight. The U.S. offer is, listen, we're terribly sad that, and we're outraged that Israel had to suffer in this way, but we'll take care of it, let us take care of it. And from everything that we have been able to gather here, the United States government simply does not know what the Israelis plan to do. And it's quite possible that when Yitzhak Shamir was talking to Jim Baker, Prime Minister Shamir himself did not know what his government was going to do. So we know this about the president's schedule tomorrow. He will be going over to the Pentagon. Now, he had planned, and I know this will sound strange to a lot of people, he had planned at mid-afternoon to get on his helicopter and fly up to Camp David for the weekend. Well, you say, why on earth would the commander-in-chief, in the middle of a war, go up to Camp David? Well, one reason is at Camp David they have communications gear which is just as sophisticated as what the president has down here. So the president felt he wouldn't be out of contact. And for reasons which I'm still somewhat unclear about, Garrick, the president wants to show that he is not overwhelmed by the crisis that we are in, that his schedule is not changing greatly. He goes over to the residential part of the White House every evening fairly early, as though it were a normal work day. This evening, during all of the crisis regarding Israel, during the attacks on Israel, he stayed over in the residential part of the White House while his aides worked here in the West Wing behind me, the working part of the White House, Secretary of State Baker, Deputy Secretary of State Larry Eagleberger, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, etc., etc. Why was George Bush taking sort of a hands-off attitude? I can't really say for sure, except for the fact that when it comes to talking to Yitzhak Shamir, maybe George Bush thought his good friend and his good Texas lawyer, Jim Baker, could do a better job.
But John Cochran, at some point, I think the president is going to want to indeed have to talk to the Israeli Prime Minister directly, that as the head of government, commander-in-chief and head of state, he wants to talk to the Israeli leader. Any indication as to when that might happen?
Well, I'm not sure it will happen. Relations between the two have been frosty. They are at best correct, Garrick, and you know what that means in diplomatic circles. It means somewhat strained. So I'm not sure but what Jim Baker was a better man to talk to Yitzhak Shamir. If George Bush had thought he could have done it better, he would have. And So this is not a personal relationship that George Bush can count on. And I'm not sure the Israelis are going to tell the U.S. government, George Bush or Jim Baker, what they're going to do before they do it. That's just not the Israeli way of doing things, as you know, Garrick.
All right, John Cochran, you've had a long day there. I hope you can get a good rest, and we'll be seeing you in the morning hours. Across the country, as we continue to follow the events in the Middle East, there are demonstrations have been taking place for and against the American military, the UN, the coalition military effort there. Today there were protests in California, both for and against that effort, and correspondent David Burrington has this report on what happened there.
The anti-war demonstrators show no sign of running out of gas. Major protests continue in San Francisco, where several thousand people converged on the stock exchange. And in Seattle, more trouble at the city's federal building. But there's also more vocal reaction now on the other side in support of the war. 1,000 high school kids rallied in Seattle.
We believe in our country, and when people believe in our country, our pride shines right through everything, and that's what I have to say.
In San Francisco, the anti-war cause has been hurt by violent incidents. A police car burned, smashed windows along the demonstration routes.
I'm against the war, but I don't feel like with any kind of violence is the answer.
Overall, the demonstrations don't appear to be changing many people's opinions, just reinforcing what they already believed.
I think that this is a point of view that needs to be expressed. I don't agree with everything that's being done, but I have more agreement with this than I do with the president's policy.
I'd rather see people supporting the troops that are risking their lives in the Middle East.
Some people feel the demonstrations get too much television coverage.
We talk about these demonstrations and they show these demonstrations, but they don't show on TV the number of people who are pro-war, whatever it is that's going on there. Get their side of the view, but they don't do that.
According to the latest Lou Harris poll, the demonstrators tend to be women, young men who worry a new draft might get them involved, and older people. Most men are solidly behind the president. Lou Harris himself, who wrote a book on opinion during Vietnam, says more than 70% of the country is rallying behind the president, but that could change.
But you have to understand that close to half the people say they will only support the war if it's short and the casualties are small. And if casualties begin to mount, I think you're going to get a melding of support here.
So can we expect to see the crowds here swell if the war drags on and there are casualties?
I'd say if the big test of our invasion of Kuwait takes place and there is an Iraqi resistance there, then I think you'll begin to get resistance and demonstrations increasing, no doubt about it.
At the moment, according to Harris, 16% of the American people are so against the war, they're willing to join in a protest. David Burrington, NBC News, San Francisco.
And as David reported, what is happening there in California, no doubt, will continue in the American cities in the days and perhaps the weeks to come as we follow the course of the war. Earlier this evening, we've been reporting to you about the first American fatality in the war, the American pilot who was shot down over Iraq during the first series of raids yesterday, Lieutenant Commander Michael Spiker of Florida. His family, of course, was notified before his name was released to the public at large. The family lives in Florida. He's a Jacksonville native. A few more details about the family. He is married, has 2 children, a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. And a family friend in Florida who asked not to be identified says the family understandably does not want to talk to reporters, and we're sure, of course, that nobody is going to badger them or try to talk with them. That is the first American fatality. We also reported a few minutes ago, Arthur Kent had the first news that a couple of American Marines were slightly wounded up near the border of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. weight during some shelling by the Iraqi side yesterday. A reminder that just how exposed Marines are there when you get involved in desert warfare. Even though they are dug into their positions and their trenches, it's a very vulnerable place to be. I recall in 1973 covering the Middle East war between Egypt and Israel down in the Sinai Desert, watching the tanks there and the troops there. It was war on a billiard table, on a pool table. There is really nowhere to hide, even if you do try to dig in. I'm sure the Marines and the other American forces there, though, are digging in even deeper tonight after that artillery barrage from the Iraqis, which left 2 Americans slightly wounded. And we'll be right back after a brief pause. We are continuing our coverage. I'm Garrett Utley in New York, and we want to go now to Israel, which has been the focus of much of our attention and much of our very direct concern this evening. The rocket attacks, the missile attacks, and the scare for some hours that they involve possibly chemical agents. Larry Weidman of NBC News is standing by in our bureau there. Larry, it's midday there. Indeed, it's afternoon, late afternoon in Israel. How are people there reacting, the Israelis reacting to this night of what must have been a considerable amount of terror?
Well, Garrick, obviously it was a long night, and actually it's just a little bit before 8 o'clock in the morning. So the Israelis yesterday morning woke up, many of them, having slept through the beginning of the war, and they experienced a day of euphoria, virtually, because of the apparently successful and wide-ranging attacks in Iraq by the American forces. And there was a widespread belief that that may have prevented the strike they had been expecting on Tel Aviv.
Well, Larry, as we look at the day now, it is daytime. Those rocket attacks, the 10 or so that landed on Israeli territory, came at night. I think some people might be interested in the difference between the advantages and disadvantages from the Iraqi point of view of a nighttime attack versus a daytime attack. What we're really dealing with here are Iraqi mobile missile launchers, and we understand that they are more effective, shall we say, if they can be operated under the cover of darkness. Do the Israelis therefore feel that something might happen during the daylight hours, either from missiles or perhaps possibly even from Iraqi airplanes?
Well, the Iraqi Air Force is not particularly feared by the Israelis. All along they've been worried most about the possibility of just the kind of missile attack we've just seen. The air raid sirens were set off this morning about 2 o'clock, and the first missiles began falling within a few minutes of that. We had been told originally that they hoped to have as much as a 4 or 5 hour warning. Very likely the night cover that you described and the use of the mobile missiles instead of the fixed positions in western Iraq allowed the Iraqis to make what in effect was a surprise attack.
As we monitor the events which are taking place on the other side of the Middle East in the Persian Gulf area itself, is the Israeli media this morning, radio, television, the newspapers, are the Israelis really following the battle going on there, or is there perhaps an understandable preoccupation with what's happening just on Israeli territory itself? In other words, is there the big picture there, or is it really focused in people's minds on Israel?
Well, Garrick, as you well know, there probably is not another country in the world which has a stronger love affair with news. And the Israelis absorb everything on television, and in fact, Israeli television is broadcasting on 2 channels virtually around the clock. People are still under an emergency alert and are asked to stay at home, and so they are focused completely on radio and television, and they are following the big picture. They understand very clearly what the implications are of this attack overnight, and the fact that the attack, fortunately, appears to have been only conventional weapons, conventional explosive warheads with no chemical weapons, means certain things to most Israelis. And obviously we're waiting now to see what decision the government takes on what kind of reaction or retaliation, if any, to take for this missile attack.
Larry, tell us a bit about journalists there. How are your colleagues able to operate now? It is, as you say, morning there. What can you do in terms of maneuvering and moving through the streets, through the country, and talking to people?
it's a relatively open country. The West Bank and Gaza are under curfew, and we're not allowed to go into those areas, although they have been quiet through the last couple of days. In the Tel Aviv area, our crews have been on the scene of the heaviest damage of the explosions this morning. We've talked to people. The government is is not quite as accessible as it usually is. Obviously, they're now in virtually a state of war, and there are security measures to be taken.
And there are big decisions to be made, too, I'm sure, Larry, as you're indicating. Thank you. We'll be back to you in a little while. Just point out that the Israeli Chief of Staff today said that the Iraqi missile attack cannot really go without a response. We'll stand by and see where that response comes, and we'll be right back.
NBC News, America at War continues.
We've been talking this evening with our correspondents in the Pentagon, in the Persian Gulf, and most recently in Israel. And we just repeat the latest dispatch we had from Israel. Of course, we've been waiting to see whether the Israeli government's going to decide to retaliate for the Iraqi missile attacks against Israel, missiles that hit in Haifa and in Tel Aviv, causing light casualties and damages overnight. The Chief of Staff of the Israeli Armed Forces, that's General Dan Shomron, is quoted as saying that this kind of an attack, quote, cannot go without a response. Such an incident requires a response, but that does not mean that the response has to come right now. So again, through this day, the Israelis have a lot of very important military but also political decisions to make, because a lot is at stake in terms of this coalition. Although those of you who have been with us throughout the evening with Tom Brokaw and his discussions with various experts probably recall that one of the themes that has been arising today is that even if the Israelis were to respond with a limited attack, let us say that is with some of their missiles, Jericho missiles targeted at Iraqi targets, and not send Israeli planes in, piloted aircraft, that perhaps that would mitigate a bit of the Israeli response. And therefore the coalition, the alliance, would not be bruised, would not fall apart. The other factor really to keep in mind here is that the Israelis understand full well, I mean, they are perhaps the paramount military specialists in that part of the region, of the importance of keeping this coalition together, and also of just how well the airstrikes are working right now against Iraq. And as Henry Kissinger said earlier on our NBC coverage, one of the things you want to make sure of right now is that you're not thrown off course. If things are going so well so far, keep on that course, and that, of course, is what the White House has no doubt been telling the Israelis this evening, but the Israelis are fully capable of understanding that themselves, so we shall see. Let's now go over to Arthur Kent, who is in Saudi Arabia, standing by. Arthur, we're really going back and forth between the Israeli story and what's happening there this morning in Saudi Arabia. What do you have for us?
Well, Garrick, we have nothing official, of course. The last thing that we will see is official pronouncements on how the raid last night on Israel might affect the relationship of the various Arab and Western partners to this U.S.-led anti-Iraq coalition. But we can tell you that the Saudis and the Kuwaitis in particular, who participated a great deal in yesterday's strikes against military targets in Iraq and Kuwait, will be very eager not to read into this situation anything which would break up the unity of the alliance that has, according to Pentagon sources, done so well against targets in those two countries. Saudi Arabia, of course, put forward about 150 aircraft in the early stages, in the first two waves of the attacks. The Kuwaitis put the remnants of the Kuwaiti Air Force up in the air yesterday, and actually lost a jet shot down by Iraqi anti-aircraft fire. So it'll be very interesting today to try to pick up in the Saudi press, official pronouncements here, any sort of rumblings which might indicate disquiet. But we don't predict it unless Israel goes to an extreme retaliatory strike against Iraq.
Well, Arthur, to follow up on that point, I think one of the things we should really point out is that although the Arab nations have been by and large united against Israel, with the exception of Egypt, which has established diplomatic relations with the Israeli government, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are not what they call in the Middle East or the Arab world front-line confrontation states. That is basically Syria, which has occupied that role. Syria, which has fought a number of wars with the Israelis and come out at the short end of the stick on most of those wars. Do you have any indication there as to whether the Saudis are concerned about Hafez al-Assad and the Syrians, whether they might weaken a bit if the Israelis were to respond?
Very interesting question, Garrick. I mean, the dynamics now of Arab politics within this region, now that Saddam Hussein, the strong man who occupied a locus between so many competing powers, not only Syria and Saudi Arabia, but Iran to the east, seems to be on the way down, seems to be about to be eliminated. We cannot read too much into what we've heard here because, of course, the Saudi royal family, which dominates the governing elite in Saudi Arabia, has played very close to its chest exactly how the new order of Arab politics might be once Saddam is removed. But we can tell you that in these preliminary stages, the priority for the Saudi government has been, to the relief of Washington thus far and the Bush administration, a show of solidarity, both in the skies over Iraq and Kuwait, and in political statements, continuing condemnation of Saddam. And again, if Israel does not react with too much force, if it does not overreact to these strikes last night, it will tend to play down any kind of disunity that results from any statements or actions taken by Israel in the forthcoming days.
Okay, Arthur Kent, thank you for that fill-in. But before you go from the heavy matters of the moment to something perhaps a little bit lighter, but I'm sure people are curious about it, the morning weather forecast, please, there in Saudi Arabia. What's it like? We see there is sun. How warm?
Again, another surprise. The desert brings them, puts them to you almost daily. Overcast only an hour ago, and now a bright, bright sun scorching through. We're back down to a shirt sleeve weather on the ground. Clear skies for aircraft taking off out of their bases in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, off the aircraft carriers out in the Red Sea and in the Gulf. We can only guess, but that this weather pattern holds true for Kuwait, some 250 miles north of here. It's going to aid them, obviously. It will also be another day in daylight operations of testing whether that Iraqi Air Force is indeed completely suppressed, whether air defenses, as the Scuds did last night, will provide U.S. and coalition aircraft with any surprises when they close on their targets today.
All right, Arthur Kent, thank you very much. In Saudi Arabia, and of course, those clear blue skies are going to be important not just for the Air Force and Navy pilots headed north. It's also good news for those people who have to read and analyze the satellite pictures that are being sent back, have been sent back since the daybreak broke after the first wave of air attacks. And that's something that the Pentagon has been concentrating on, and Jamie Gangel has taken over there. Good evening, Jamie.
Good, I think it's good morning.
Good morning,
Garrick,
I should say. It depends what part of the country you are in. But do you have any indication as to what the satisfaction level might be in terms of the satellite reports they're getting back? I mean, there must be hundreds or thousands of them they have to go through.
They're certainly going through that now, getting battle assessments. But I just want to go back for a second to one thing that Arthur was talking about with these Scuds. What we're being told here repeatedly, Garrick, is to be cautious and remember that this can happen again. Although they took out a lot of the hard-based Scud missiles, the word here is that for these mobile base missiles that can move around, the Scuds, that at best maybe 20 or 30% were taken out. And so there's still a lot of concern, and again stress that what happened tonight in both Israel and Iran can happen again.
If we look not just at the issue of the Scuds, but just the issue of another aspect of this war, which is information flow. Now, I'm sure people have been watching our program, following the events. They're staying up late in many parts of the country. Any indication as to when we're going to get another dose of plain old-fashioned information as to what's happening?
It's tough. The next briefing will be at 7 a.m. East Coast time. That will be by General Schwarzkopf from Saudi Arabia. One of the things that was stressed to me tonight by a senior Pentagon official who had been doing very much the same thing during the Panama invasion was that there everything was on about the same time frame. Here we have an 8-hour difference between the East Coast and Saudi Arabia. Then you have troops that are even further out, so that the base in Saudi is waiting for reports to come back from all over the desert and front lines there. So there's quite a bit of lag time, and that's very frustrating here. Frequently, they're hearing about things first, frankly, by watching us on television.
When we talk about information and about briefings, it'll be interesting to see and hear General Schwarzkopf. He's a man I think most or many Americans have become well familiar with, not only a very experienced combat leader, a combat officer, but a man of a particular turn of mind. And from the Pentagon side, the man in uniform we've been seeing most often is General Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Do you think the Pentagon will start to be bringing other uniformed senior officers out to brief the public and the press, or are they going to stick with Powell and Schwarzkopf?
Well, we're hearing, in fact, that Tom Kelly, who's #2 at the Joint Chiefs, will be doing some briefing tomorrow, so we will see some other people coming in. But the fact of the matter is that both General Powell and Schwarzkopf are very impressive. They've come across very well. The building is clearly comfortable with them. The White House is clearly very comfortable with the job that they've been doing. So I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of both of them.
All right. Thank you very much, Jamie Gangel at the Pentagon. Interesting aspect about General Schwarzkopf, of course, he has a very distinguished career. He also has a great deal of family experience in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf region. His father served the U.S. government as an advisor to Iran many years ago. This is before the present regime, the successors of Ayatollah Khomeini, came to power there. He was an advisor on police and security matters. So General Schwarzkopf grew up in a family which was aware of and sensitive to the various dynamics, the forces at play in the Middle East. And several weeks ago, shortly after he arrived there, in fact, he gave an interview which was interesting, showed that he had a political insight as well as military experience, saying that we must be careful not to destroy Iraq, not to destroy its military forces, because that would create instability, a vacuum. That's one of the things we've been talking about with Gary Sick, who is back with us, among others, that General Schwarzkopf, a military man, has this kind of touch, so to speak, for the area, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. And that's really very, I should think, reassuring for all of us to think that we have military men, and having been a military man, I have a certain sense about that. But to find people that are scholars in uniform, people who know something about the area that they're working in, and who are, in fact, sensitive to political issues as well. And I think that's a wonderful choice for our commander there.
And we have it not only in General Schwarzkopf, who's the man on the ground there, we also have it in Colin Powell, four-star general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was National Security Advisor.
And before that, we had it with Bill Crow, the Admiral Crow, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a PhD from Princeton, political scientist, long political experience as well. I mean,
so in a way, the job description for the jobs at the top of the military ladder has been going through some evolution, hasn't it?
I think it really has, yes. I mean,
now, Gary Sick, you worked for several years in the National Security Council at the White House, really concerning yourself with affairs in Iraq, Iran, the Persian Gulf area. People who really follow this, look at this, we see a Jim Baker, we see a Dick Cheney out there, but just below this, these top officials, what's happening there in the White House these days, in that National Security Council area? We see very often the lights burning late in Brent Scowcroft's office there in the corner in the West Wing. Give us a bit of the atmosphere.
Well, they work almost as hard as you journalists.
Probably a lot harder. I hope they know a lot more, too.
Usually not, unfortunately. And that's one of the things that I think is most surprising to people on the outside, is that you think that these people must have all of this wonderful information at hand, fingertip feel for everything. Well, they have a lot of classified information that you and I don't have to work with, but 99% of the really important information is the stuff that is known, if not that day, is known within a day or two, and you can put it together in the political analysis and the like. I found, frankly, with virtually all of the intelligence information of the government available to me, that I ended up relying on press reports, news reports from around the world, the kind of thing that not everybody just reads, but which is basically unclassified, as was the most insightful. A full text of a speech by a foreign leader is worth more than a secret report of a third-hand report of a conversation that he had that is reported by the CIA.
And here it is, we, the journalists, thinking that you fellows in the National Security Council have all this information, this classified information we can't get our hands on.
That's right. Well, sometimes the classified information is quite important, and especially on a tactical basis. I was thinking, think about it. Today, we are in the midst of the largest bombing campaign in the history of the world.
Even, let's stop right there, even greater than World War II?
Absolutely. This is the most intensive bombing campaign in the history of the world. And today, we didn't hear about a single target being struck. We don't know how many sorties took off. We don't know where they went. We don't know what collateral damage there was. The Iraqis aren't talking about it. Our forces aren't talking about it. We know virtually nothing. This whole war has been going on around us, and it's invisible.
Is this proper?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we should be, I'm not a journalist. I've been spending a lot of time around journalists in recent days, but I really think that we should have some sense. Are there factories being hit as opposed to military sites? What kind of collateral damage is? What are those satellite photos showing? We just learned after they fired the missiles at Israel, we discovered that the first strike really only got a small proportion of the Scud launchers. We'd been led to believe that the Scud launchers were really wiped out.
Well, let's follow up on this. The fact that we aren't getting more information, does that raise the suspicion in your mind that although the raids on the whole seem to be going very well, we aren't there yet, that there are still some points of...
well, it makes me a little nervous because when the people doing it are in control of the information totally, they have the capability of concealing mistakes, problems, things that go wrong get glossed over. And to some degree, that perhaps is inevitable. I mean, there's nothing you can do about that in wartime, and they give you pretty much what you want. But the information flow has been so minute here that I'm not suspecting anybody of a cover-up or anything. I just think that the people in a democracy deserve to know more about what their forces are actually doing.
Well, we'll see how the information comes out in the hours to come. Gary Sick, thank you very much, and continue to stand by. Just to resume where we are as we continue to follow events in the Middle East. Israel, of course, has been the big story tonight, the launching by Iraq of missiles against Israel. And we're going to have some tape of the situation there in just a moment. It happened during the middle of the night, Israeli time. It was a shock, although not a total surprise. The Israelis had braced themselves for that, preparing for attacks, perhaps gas or chemical warfare attacks. In the event, what were fired off were approximately 10 or so missiles from Iraqi territory, the Scud missiles, which is a Soviet-based built missile, fired at Israeli targets. One of them struck near the city of Haifa. Several others struck near Tel Aviv. They did cause some damage there. They caused injuries to about 7 people, according to the Israeli government. Among 7 Israelis, but not serious. Then, of course, the events in Baghdad, the scenes last night during the initial airstrike, some spectacular scenes. We've been showing these to you periodically through the day and the evening, but the pictures speak for themselves. This was Baghdad, middle of the night, videotaped there from a hotel shortly after the air assault began. You can hear the sound of exploding bombs and cruise missiles, the Tomahawk missiles, and occasionally see some ground fire from the anti-aircraft defenses. That was Baghdad last night. Also, as we look at this mosaic, the total panorama of what is happening not only in the battle area, the war theater itself, but also on the home front. Another aspect are demonstrations that have been occurring here and there. We have some videotape of that in terms of people really voicing their opinions. This San Francisco, California, a crowd there, newspaper headline telling the story. To some people, perhaps a bit reminiscent of the Vietnam era, although by no means are these demonstrations the size of what happened then when streets and boulevards and large portions of large cities were filled by angry protesters. In San Francisco, some people were arrested by the police early in the day. They broke a human chain there, which is around a federal building. So earlier tonight, Tom Brokaw talked to Ron Kovic, who was a Vietnam veteran. I'm sure you've heard about him. He was injured there severely and has become a symbol and one of the more articulate voices in the anti-war rallies. And Tom talked to Ron Kovic, who was at a rally in Westward in California. Here's what they said.
UCLA, and I just want to report to you that over 700 students have taken over the main administration building. They are planning to shut down the entire campus tomorrow. And this is a very powerful peace movement that's growing across this country. And I think, Tom, with what's happening in the Middle East, you are going to see an extremely powerful anti-war movement growing very rapidly in this country. There is a cry that's going out amongst thousands and thousands of us, and that is, bring our young men and women home, let them live. We do not want this war, and we want the killing and the bombing to stop, Tom. We are against this killing, we are against this bombing, and we know that there has got to be a peaceful solution. We're crying out for peace all over this country, and we're going to sit down in the streets. We're going to take over the bridges, the buildings. We're going to sit in the senator's office and the congressman's offices. We're going to take over the universities peacefully and non-violently. But if we have to shut down this whole country, Tom, we're going to do that.
Ron Kovic, what about the chances for a peaceful solution? Saddam Hussein was given every conceivable opportunity to withdraw his troops from Kuwait, and he took none of them. You cannot deal with this man, it seems, from a diplomatic or a political point of view. Ultimately, how would you deal with him?
We must avoid killing, and we must avoid the destruction of other human beings and innocent civilians, Tom. There are ways, there is dialogue, there is still room for peace, and I feel that more and more people across this country are beginning to oppose the president and the war makers. We're not going to stand for this war, Tom. We are not going to stand for this killing. We are better Americans than that. We are better Americans than that, Tom. We want peace, and we know that this is not the way to go.
Ron.
They killed a million Vietnamese and put the names of 58,000 of my friends on a wall in Washington, D.C. We're not going to let them do it again, Tom. We're not going to let them do it again.
Vietnam veteran Ron Kovic speaking earlier this evening from a rally in California with Tom Brokaw here in New York. Speaking of demonstrations, one of the questions we've been posing this evening is why there has not been a reaction, a public reaction, demonstrations or worse in Arab countries in the Middle East following the start of the war there. Let's get some opinions in Washington from two Middle East experts we've been talking with on and off this evening, Robert Lieber and Joyce Starr. Joyce, let's start with you. When do you think we're going to get some kind of a response from the man and the women in the street in Arab capitals?
Well, I think that we need to talk about which Arab capitals, because in Turkey, for example, the president of Turkey, Turgut Özal, has been so staunchly with the United States, and I think the people are going to be behind their president. In the case of Syria, obviously the people do what Mr. Assad would like them to do. In the case of Egypt, we may see some limited demonstrations, but I think it will come down to just that if Israel should attack. So country by country, we should make our analysis rather than a broad brush look about the man in the street. Each man is different in each Arab capital, not to mention each woman.
All right, let's be specific. Jordan. Now, throughout this crisis, we've seen big crowds in Jordan. Robert Lieber, many Palestinians there. A majority of the people in that country are Palestinians. A great deal of sympathy for Saddam Hussein. They see Saddam as their hero. Why aren't we getting a reaction from Jordan?
Well, Jordan is perhaps two-thirds Palestinian, but the problem of the Palestinians is they're in disarray. Nobody much has helped them, not their own leaders, who have in many respects betrayed them or served them badly, not Saddam, who has used them as a convenient excuse, but who doesn't really care a thing for them. But you have to look at individual countries, and I think one of the tragedies in our analysis of the Arab world in this crisis is the willingness to embody cliches, to talk about the Arab world or the Arab nationalism, when in fact the reality is a great division among different countries and interests. Those countries closest to Saddam have got a pretty healthy distaste for him. Take the Egyptians, where millions of Egyptians served as workers in Iraq during the 1980s, especially in the war.
And they've been forced to come home now, haven't they?
They were brutally mistreated, and in fact, the average Egyptian in the street, rather than rising to these Saddam appeals to Arab nationalism and hating Zionism and the West in America, the average Egyptian in the street has a real loathing for Saddam.
Robert Lieber, Joyce, thank you. We'll be back after a break. Some of the later dispatches we are getting as we check in on the wire services covering events in the Middle East, where it is now morning. It's 9:30, for example, in the Gulf. Coming from Israel, and the Israeli military chief provided some hints about what his government, his country may do in response to the Iraqi missiles fired at Tel Aviv and Haifa overnight. He didn't say there was going to be a retaliation, but he said that certainly a response by the Israeli forces would be justified, would be called for. Earlier this evening, you may have seen and heard the Israeli ambassador in Washington speaking to the people here in the United States, emphasizing that Israel always had the right of retaliation when it was attacked, the right to make a unilateral decision according to its own best interests, and emphasizing the fact that now it was the only country that was really being attacked physically by Iraqi forces, and that therefore they had every right to do so if they wanted to retaliate. Now, what is interesting here is that the Israelis seem to be doing two things at one time. They are staking out the right to do whatever they want to do, at the same time trying to show a certain amount of sensitivity to the necessity, the priority of holding together this coalition and the cohesiveness of the military operations, which seem to be underway, progressing so effectively in this first day or two of the airstrikes. But obviously, if there is a second attack by Iraqi missiles against Israel, the Israelis would find it very difficult to show any kind of additional patience. So it is daylight over there, and we can be sure, despite in the absence of any briefings from the Pentagon or from the American command in Saudi Arabia, that a great deal of attention is being paid by those planes flying over Iraq to search out the mobile missile launchers. And what we are seeing here in this war of high technology, of missiles, as well as airplanes and smart weapons, is that although it is relatively easy to target and destroy fixed sites, it is extremely difficult to find a target, such as a mobile missile, which may be on the back of a truck or a semi-trailer and is being driven around at night, and then in the daytime being hidden underground in a bunker. I recall in the 1973 war, when I was down in the Sinai, I was up just behind the Israeli lines, approximately 3 hours before the crossing of the Suez Canal, and suddenly the road we were on, which had been totally empty in the middle of the Sinai Desert, suddenly within 20 minutes filled with Israeli tanks, pontoon bridges, mobile bridges, thousands of vehicles and troops. All of those vehicles had been held several hundred yards off the side of the road in bunkers under sand dunes. They were there. They were mobile. That's the kind of needle in the haystack that they're looking for today, those mobile missile launchers. Let's go back now to our Middle East experts in Washington, Robert Lieber and Joyce Starr, who have been giving us some of their insights in terms of what is happening there. You were making a good point a moment ago, both of you, I think, that we in the United States tend to sort of lump the Arab world into one, just one segment, one group, rather than distinguishing between the various nationalities there. Let's talk about these differences and start with the Iraqis. Saddam Hussein, and we're talking about personality here, we're aware of Saddam Hussein's personality, but in any way, does Saddam really reflect the Iraqis, the Iraqi personality?
Well, Saddam runs a regime which is genuinely totalitarian. It's a word that sounds like a cliche, widely misused, but this is a society where to disagree with the leader of Iraq, to tell a joke about him, can get you killed and perhaps get your children tortured in front of your eyes first. Among his innermost circle of advisors, to bring him bad news risks having yourself fall out of a helicopter. This is not a prototypical Arab or Arab society per se, but the one reason the Middle East is so unstable and dangerous is the process of modernization there is truncating a centuries-long process that took place in the West into a matter of decades with modern missiles and television.
Well, Robert Lieber and Joyce Starr, stand by there. We're going to be back to you in just a moment as we continue our coverage. We're going to pause now for a brief break, and we'll be right back.
Fix it.